Species. Unite.
Species. Unite.
What I did not expect to see from farmed monkeys being bought and transported into the US were monkeys who were coming in with things like Ebola-like viruses, malaria, tuberculosis, simian retrovirus, herpes viruses, salmonella, Yersinia, Campylobacter, unnamed deadly diarrheal diseases. They were coming in with tier 1 select agents. I mean, we're talking pathogens so deadly that the government has identified them as potential bioterrorism threats.
Hi, I'm Elizabeth Novogratz. This is Species Unite. We'd like to thank Lush for sponsoring today's episode. Lush advocates for people, animals, and the planet. Through their ethically sourced ingredients and their grants program, they give back locally and around the world. In 2022, 1,000 long-tailed macaques were stolen from the wild in Cambodia. They were illegally imported to Charles River Laboratories in Texas. Because they were wild-caught and not born in captivity, which is why they're illegal, they were denied clearance by U.S. Fish and Wildlife. So now they're in kind of a limbo, and decisions are being made as to whether to send them back to Cambodia, where they'll end up in labs somewhere else in the world, kill them, or do the right thing and send them to Born Free's primate sanctuary. So I asked Dr. Lisa Jones-Engel to come on the show and discuss the fate of these macaques. And on April 11th, we did a live episode. What you're about to hear is that episode. And unfortunately, because we did it as a webinar, the sound isn't great. But it's a super important episode. Lisa spent much of her career working in biomedical laboratories with primates. She knows everything that goes on the inside. And in 2019, when she couldn't take it anymore, she left that world and joined forces with PETA. She's PETA's senior science advisor, and she's a leader in the fight to get primates out of animal research and experimentation. Thank you, Lisa, for being here today. It is absolutely awesome to have you.
Yeah, thank you very, very much for inviting me in. I will always talk about monkeys.
So we're here mostly to talk about the 1,000 monkeys that are kind of in limbo right now, which we're going to get into. But before we start, I want to talk about your story and your background, really starting in the beginning, your work with primates.
It was a Jane Goodall film, 4th grade. I saw it and I knew at that time, so this is back in the 70s, that I wanted to do something with animals. And so I was a junior in high school, and I started writing to magazines like National Geographic and Smithsonian. So we are pre-internet days where we're talking letters and typewriters and whatnot. And they sent the names back. The editor sent the names back of folks like Jane Goodall and Birute Galdikas and Diane Fossey and the Craigheads. And I wrote to them. And Birute Galdikas, who had set up an orangutan research center in Kalimantan, Indonesia, replied. And, very quickly, I left high school early. I hopped on a plane, had never been off really the east coast of the US, flew to Borneo, spent 8 months working at the rehabilitation site at Tanjung Puting. The orangutans are amazing. Orangutans are big, they're bold, they're red, they're fabulous animals. But there are also monkeys there. And there were macaques, and particularly they were long-tailed. And these guys weren't nearly as big and bold. They were kind of dun-colored, they're small-bodied monkeys, beautiful long tails, longer than their body. And they're noisy, and they're social, and they're active, and they're so intense. They're really the opposite of the orangutan. I was smitten, Birute had me following them through the swamps every day, just kind of doing a basic ecological study on them. I was accompanied by one of the dayaks there. I fell in love with macaques. I I went back to the US, though, went to undergraduate. And then, life, there was this weird ping. I suddenly found myself working in the primate biomedical community. So I was down at Yerkes. I was then at LEMSIP, the Laboratory for Experimental Medicine and Surgery in Primates in upstate New York. I found myself working with captive primates, particularly the apes, chimpanzees. Now we're in the mid 80s, which we were using, the primate biomedical field was using for experiments to test vaccines, to try to develop HIV treatments and vaccines. I had a mentor at LEMSEP. His name was Jim Mahoney. And Jim Mahoney said something to me which has followed me my entire career. Jim loved the primates he was working with. He was a veterinarian and a PhD. He was a very solid scientist. But he said, Lisa, if we're going to be using these primates in biomedical research, two things have to happen. One, the welfare must be the absolute best we can give it to these animals. And two, the science has to be impeccable. And, over the next 30 years, because I basically, at that point, I grew up in the primate biomedical community. Those two fundamental rules were not being met anywhere. The welfare was horrific. The science was lousy. As my career kind of expanded within that arena of primate biomedical research, I spent 20 years in Asia, kind of developing this international team called Team Monkey. And what we were doing was looking at how infectious diseases move back and forth between monkeys, predominantly these macaques, and humans, and looking at what happens at that interface. What kind of contact, what type of environment facilitates the movement of these pathogens, and what is moving. And one thing became very clear, that the primates, the non-human primates, had a lot more to fear infectious disease-wise and every other reason-wise. The monkeys had more to fear from humans than humans had to fear from the monkeys. But my job in the industry was basically to better characterize the monkey model, with the idea that if the scientists better understood what was happening in their monkeys, the type of pathogens that were in their monkeys, they would better understand the data that were coming out. The industry did not want to hear that. The industry we just want our monkeys. Just get me my monkeys, put my monkeys in the cage. That's all that they want to hear about. And as I started kind of continuing to battle those forces within the industry, when I realized that even the Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, which is the oversight body that every university that receives federal funds must have this, when this oversight body was basically like, don't ask, don't tell, just let the investigators do what they want, I was done. Jim's words, which had been ringing in my ear for 30 years, made me realize I had to stop. I could no longer be a part of that. And during those 30 years, I had absolutely no contact whatsoever with the animal rights community. I mean, if you're in the industry, you don't look. You assume the animal rights community is just a bunch of nitwits who know nothing, who are extremists, who, kind of twist in the truth. But the first day that I spoke to Kathy Guillermo and Olga Chadna from PETA on the phone, I realized if the industry had any idea how smart, how organized, how detailed a group like PETA was, they would have thrown in the hat a long time ago. So I joined them, and that's where I've been for the last, it'll be 4 years this year.
Congratulations on that. It's awesome, but it's also awesome because you have so much knowledge and experience. I mean, you were in it. You always hear stories about what's a committee called?
Yeah. The Institutional Animal Care and Use Committee, the IACUCs.
Like that they're terrible, but the fact that you were on one.
I think what the public hears, when the public does hear about animal research, the standard, the pat phrase is, there is so much oversight, there's so much regulation, we are so focused on animal welfare. And none of that is true. Yeah. The oversight committees are rubber stamps. The welfare is having a monkey in a cage the size of your lower kitchen cabinet, a steel cage with 2 steel bars as its perch. And that is 24/7 where that animal, this highly social animal, is. There's nothing that resembles welfare there. And again, as a scientist, I'm a good scientist. I published a lot of papers. I got a lot of NIH funding, Fulbright scholar. Science is really important. And to know that this industry in particular held such little regard for basic scientific principles about reproducibility, translatability, transparency about what we're doing in our experiments. That was an offense that is unacceptable. Yeah, that's why I'm here.
I'm glad that you're here, Lisa. Thank you. I want to talk today about these 1,000 monkeys, the 1,000 macaques. I was talking to a friend this morning. I was telling her about our conversation this afternoon, and I said, yeah, it's about these 1,000 macaques. And I told her kind of what was happening, and she was like, stop, Beth. First of all, what's a macaque? And second of all, we test on them? So I think most people who are actually here right now are somewhat aware of what's happening. But for people who listen to this later as a podcast, I really want to take it apart and start with, who are these 1,000 monkeys? How did they get here? And their story.
Sure. Well, let's start with the macaque.
Yeah.
The macaques, particularly the kind of the long-tailed macaques, the one that I first met in Borneo, they are the simian backbone of this biomedical industry. The primate biomedical industry has used macaques, and there are a couple of different species of macaques. There's the long-tailed macaque, the rhesus macaque, the pig-tailed macaque. But the industry has really kind of focused on macaques since the 1950s. But the macaques are just one of the species, one of the types of primates that the biomedical industry has used. And basically, back in the 50s, they started pulling monkeys from and apes from anywhere they could find. So chimpanzees, gorillas, bonobos, baboons, vervets, marmosets, squirrel monkeys, long-tailed macaques, pig-tailed macaques, rhesus macaques, you name it. The industry was convinced that, hey, if we grab every monkey and every primate we can put our hands on, bring them to the US, drop them into what were then called the regional primate research centers, these facilities that the government set up, and give investigators a chance to use them to experiment on them, then we're going to be guaranteed that we will be able to cure human diseases. We will be able to just bring real health to people just like this. Well, that didn't work. And that didn't work for so many reasons. It didn't work because, monkeys and apes they're not furry little humans. There are millions and millions of years of evolution that separate us. The industry says, hey, we use chimpanzees or we use monkeys because they are so similar to us. Chimpanzees might be our closest living relatives, but there was still about 5.5 million years of evolutionary distance between us. And actually, about a decade ago, the scientific community said, you know what, this whole using chimp things to develop vaccines, it didn't quite work. So they're not replicating human disease in the same way that we thought. They're not leading to HIV vaccines. We're going to stop using chimpanzees. The industry then looked around. They were terrified. They're like, oh my God, they're taking away our primates. They then started really focusing on the macaques. And the macaques and these are the most wonderful, unbiased, wonderful primates in the world. I mean, they're naturally distributed throughout Southeast Asia. You can find macaques from basically Afghanistan all the way to the Philippines and different species throughout that area. There used to be millions and millions of macaques that were free-ranging. Macaques are great because they understand us. Macaques, particularly the long tails and the rhesus, they can live with humans. We find them in the cities. We find them in the temples. They're part of the religion, part of the culture. They are a critical part of the ecosystem. And because they're so successful, that kind of was their downfall, because the industry kind of looked around and said, "Oh, there are a bunch of monkeys running around over there. Hey, just go grab them and stuff them in the cages. Send them over to us. We'll take those monkeys and we'll put them in our labs and we'll try to use them because you took away our chimps." But again, it doesn't work. It hasn't worked. And in the 21st century, more than a million macaques have been brought into the US for use in biomedical research. Those monkeys were taken from the forests of Asia and Mauritius.
So many so that now 2 of the species are on the endangered species list.
Exactly. It is, I would say it's incomprehensible, except we've looked at data, so it is comprehensible. The populations have declined so dramatically in the long-tailed and pig-tailed macaques that they move these animals to the endangered species list, the red list of threatened and endangered species. Think about that. Oh, and the real kicker was that they said that particularly for the long-tailed macaque, the extraction, the utilization, which was the nice word they used, the utilization of these primates, of these macaques, by the primate biomedical industry was one of the main drivers of the population decline. The US biomedical industry has driven 2 species of primates, 2 species of mammals to the brink of extinction. And the taxpayer is actually funding this indirectly. And people don't know this.
It's all horrible. It's horrible if they're raised in labs. It's horrible if they're stolen from the wild. I think we all agree it's all horrible. But the way it's supposed to work is that these macaques are supposed to be imported to the US, but they're supposed to be lab born in Cambodia or wherever they come from. And they're supposed to be a certain generation. How does that work?
All right, it's going to take a minute to kind of lay this one out. You remember I said back in the 50s, the National Primate Research Centers they were grabbing monkeys and apes from all over the world. Well, they realized then that there were a couple of problems with that. One, the animals, after making these international journeys, they'd arrive dead. They'd arrive infected with things like tuberculosis or measles or deadly diarrheal pathogens. That then the people who were supposed to be taking care of them were then getting sick and infected from the monkeys. So the industry was like, this isn't a good business model. One, the monkeys are, we buy them, we trap them, we pay for them to come over, and they arrive dead, so they're not good to us. Plus, they're making our workers sick. Plus, it's just this whole disease thing is scary to us. So the industry started really kind of in the late 80s, more towards the 90s, saying, you know what? We need to have better characterized. We need to have specific pathogen-free monkeys, because if we're going to be using them in our experiments, we want them healthy. We want them free of pathogens. We want them kind of genetically well characterized. And the only way, and they were smart enough to realize this, the only way that we stand any chance of getting that is to actually breed them in captivity. So they started setting up these big monkey farms in Southeast Asia and in Mauritius. And in these monkey farms, the idea was that they would wild catch mom and dad. They would send the trappers out into the forest. These are really social animals. They live in large social groups, the macaques. At night, they all come back to a sleeping tree. And depending on where you are in the hierarchy, it kind of depends on where you are in the huddle on the sleeping tree. You're high-ranking animal. You're right in the middle of this huddle, and you're nice and warm. You're toasting. You're well-groomed. But the whole troop, 30, 40, 50 animals will come back to the sleeping tree at night, and everyone goes to sleep. And that's their downfall, because the trappers, they follow them. They know where that sleeping tree is, and then they cut down all the trees that are surrounding that one sleeping tree. Then they lay the nets on the ground around it. The monkeys wake up. They're already kind of awake, but they see these people down there, and so they're scared. They're all huddling together. The sun comes up, and then the trappers start, shaking the tree or making noises. The other trees are too far away for them to leap to, so they have to come down. So they run down the tree, and then I'm sorry, actually, because I see it and I know exactly what's happening. They're grabbing every animal they can get their hands on, and macaques, the adults, will fight to the death for their infants. Moms will not let their kids go, but they do not stand a chance. clubs are flying, long tails are being grabbed, moms are being grabbed, the males are being beaten to death because they are ferociously angry at that point. Moms are grabbed, the infants are grabbed off of them, stuffed into the bamboo crates. Other animals are stuffed into the net bags. Everybody's thrown into the back of a truck and they're taken to the farm. And those who survived, kind of that forms the breeding stock. So those are the wild caught. So you've got a wild caught mom, you've got a wild caught dad. You generally have a lot more wild caught moms because you only need a few dads.
Right.
Then you start making the offspring. And the first offspring are then captive born. So wild parents are captive born. But it takes about 3 years. You've got to get the mom pregnant. The infant has to be born. The infant has to grow up for about 3 years. Or that female will be bred with another captive born male. And then after another 3 years, you have what's called the F2 generation. And so this is the generation of captive born animal that's supposed to be then allowed to be shipped out to the US for use. So it can take about 6 years, to start really getting some monkeys. And don't forget, in captivity, these animals are, psychologically, they're destroyed. They're in these pens. You might have, 20 or 30, 40 monkeys stuffed into a 10 by 10, concrete floored, wired pen. Their job, their purpose is to get pregnant and to produce an offspring. You've destroyed the social structure of the animals. You've taken everything away from them that makes them a macaque. You're feeding them food that, this kind of manufactured monkey biscuit stuff. They're bored, they're stressed, they're terrified, they're diseased. They're dying. They're shedding pathogens back and forth. They're picking up pathogens and viruses and bacteria from the workers who are there. The infant mortality rate is incredibly high. So you can see that as a business model, this doesn't quite hold up. And that's what the industry realized real quick. They're like, all right, so we say scientifically, we know that if you're going to be using these monkeys, they have to be healthy, they have to be well characterized, they have to be free of specific pathogens, bacteria and viruses. But we really want monkeys. So the demand was so strong, and actually the supply was just not there. Yeah. The females weren't producing the infants weren't living. And so, and you've got the demand coming here from the US saying, give me more monkeys. So the folks over there are like, all right, you want more monkeys? So we'll go out and we'll just grab more wild monkeys. We'll go back to those sleeping trees. We'll cut it down again. We'll just grab already 1 to 2 year old animals who were naturally wild born. And we'll sell you those. And what happened, where they got busted last year, was that they mislabeled, they intentionally falsely labeled those wild caught monkeys as captive bred. So whereas because the industry has known for decades, everyone in the industry knew that wild catching was happening. We all did. We just knew. They're outright lying when folks like Charles River and Innovative and Envigo and Orient Bio and Worldwide Primates and say, oh, we didn't know they were wild bullshit.
When you say Charles River and Innovative, will you just say who those folks are, just for people who don't know?
So that when I've been talking about industry for a while, talking about the primate biomedical industry, and that industry is kind of, it has like two arms. So you have the National Primate Research Centers, you have the National Institutes of Health, you have university laboratories that use monkeys in biomedical research, basic research. And then you have the big pharma industry. And big pharma use these monkeys in some basic research, but they also tend to really use these monkeys in toxicology research. And so Charles River Laboratories, Innovative, part of the Envigo Beagle group, Worldwide Primates, Orient Bioresources, Free Labs, Alta Science. These are all big pharma companies that are these enormous consumers of these macaques.
1,000 monkeys came into the U.S. Is this the norm? They come in and Fish and Wildlife inspects? Is that happens every time? Or
It surprised me. I didn't think much could surprise me about my former industry very much anymore, but I was surprised. So do you remember back in January of 2022 when there was that accident up in Danville, Pennsylvania? Newly imported monkeys. They had just been offloaded off an airplane coming in from Mauritius. They'd been picked up and they were being driven to someplace. And the truck was in an accident and cages of monkeys spilled out onto the highway in January. Some of the cages broke open. 3 monkeys got loose. The CDC and Pennsylvania Department of Health basically ordered a shoot on site because a risk assessment was done, and the risk was so great to the public for these monkeys that they ordered these 3 that were loose shot on site. Those monkeys were headed to a quarantine facility because there's been a regulation on the books for decades, actually, that monkeys who are imported into the U.S. must undergo a 31-day CDC-required quarantine period. And during this quarantine period, these animals are supposed to be observed. They're tested for things like tuberculosis, for things like Ebola, these hemorrhagic diseases. I always thought that the CDC-required quarantines were conducted at the airport where these monkeys land and were conducted by the CDC. And actually, what we learned in that Danville accident was neither of those things are true. Monkeys get off the plane, they get loaded onto a truck, and then they're driven to undisclosed locations. It's like monkey black sites in this country. These animals are driven to some place, and it is actually the importers themselves who conduct this CDC-required quarantine. Thank you for that look, because that look says it all. The conflict of interest here is stunning.
Wow.
And we started getting a taste of that conflict of interest when we FOIA'd, when we submitted a Freedom of Information Act request to the CDC right after this Danville accident. We're like, you were so afraid of these monkeys. Exactly what have these monkeys been coming into this country with in the past few years? We received those documents in July of 2022. And Beth, I mean, my entire academic career was focused on disease transmission between humans and primates. So I know what's kind of out there. What I did not expect to see from farmed monkeys being bought and transported into the US were monkeys who were coming in with things like Ebola-like viruses, malaria, tuberculosis, simian retrovirus, herpes viruses, salmonella, Yersinia, Campylobacter, unnamed deadly diarrheal diseases. They were coming in with tier 1 select agents. I mean, we're talking pathogens so deadly that the government has identified them as potential bioterrorism threats. These are monkeys who have supposedly been farmed, been shown to be healthy and robust and free and specific pathogen free, getting on these planes, flying halfway around the world, being trucked who knows where in this country. And in the first 31 days of quarantine, this is what they're seeing. And then it turns out monkeys are actually released from quarantine. These pathogens were not detected, and they're showing up in laboratories and facilities all around the country with these same deadly pathogens. It's not an irony. It's a stupidity. This industry is saying to the public, we must have these monkeys in order to keep you healthy, to keep you safe, to make vaccines. This industry is basically bringing in the next pandemic with every monkey that they bring in.
When they bring in these wild-caught monkeys, they put a collar on them that says lab monkey instead of wild-caught, and the collar's removable. But this is how you're supposed to believe that these aren't from the wild. That's how it works?
Exactly. We learned about this in the indictment in November of 2022. So in November of 2022, Fish and Wildlife and the Department of Justice indicted 8 individuals who were involved in monkey laundering, basically shipping monkeys to the US for these big importers and saying that these monkeys were captive bred. And what the indictment actually showed was what was happening is that these monkeys, and you're right, so in the farms, every monkey gets a metal collar that has a little tag on it, and that tag has, it's like I was about to say it's their dog tag, but it's their monkey tag that has their ID on it. And there's supposed to be a paper trail that talks about, who this monkey's mom was, who this monkey's grandmom was, who their dad was, their grandfather, who their brothers or sisters. They're supposed to be kind of this genealogy identifying that these were captive bred animals. That's because that's on the permit that they left the country with. They were listed as captive bred. But what we found in this indictment was that no, these animals get to the kind of staging area. The veterinarians look at them and they start disqualifying some of them. Disqualified. I love that word. They were disqualified because they were already dead, or they were so diseased, or they were positive for things like TB or some of these other viruses that, you really shouldn't be putting a monkey on a plane with that. And so those disqualified animals, the collar was taken off. And then in through the back door came these black market, wild caught monkeys, and the collar went on that. So it was like monkey identity theft. I mean, it was just this, there's a dead monkey on the ground here, you remove its ID and just place it on this one, and away they went.
With these 1,000 monkeys that we're kind of focusing on today, they came into the country, they had collars. So why did U.S. Fish and Wildlife do DNA tests when that's something that they don't normally do?
So we don't know that Fish and Wildlife has actually done any DNA testing on those animals yet. So the way that's what's kind of worked out, the U.S. Fish and Wildlife had a 5-year investigation in Cambodia, 5-year undercover investigation. And, they got, we do know from some of the documents we've read in this indictment, there are videos, there are all types, there are email, there are phone records, there are, hard copies of records. This is a very strong case against these individuals and the unnamed, unindicted co-conspirators here in the U.S. But to your question, it's a fundamental question. Why has there not been up to this point any way, any oversight to ensure that the animals that are coming in truly are captive bred? And I think the answer to that question is because the industry did not want that level of scrutiny. And this industry is incredibly powerful. They're lobbying Congress, they're lobbying the White House, they're lobbying everyone they can to say, just let us do our thing. Look someplace else while we continue to do our thing. Fish and Wildlife has stepped up and said, no.
But how did then they know that these were wild-caught monkeys?
Well, the onus is actually on the importer. So this is where it gets incredibly technical. So let me see if I can explain this as simply as I can. Monkeys, when they leave one country and go into another, they travel on something called a CITES permit. And the CITES permit, you're supposed to list every single animal. You list their identifier, you describe them, their age, their sex, their weight, and you're supposed to write, and there's a column where you actually note whether or not this animal is captive, whether it's wild caught, what it's supposed to be used for. This investigation knew what was going on. They saw what was going on in the back. They knew that these documents were falsified.
Okay.
And that's a violation of the Lacey Act. The false labeling is what it's called. And the Lacey Act is an act that's probably the most powerful wildlife protection act that we're using here, that Fish and Wildlife is using here in the States. And they're using this false labeling as kind of one of the arms to really go after these folks. What Fish and Wildlife has said to the importers is, prove to us that these are captive born monkeys. And the importer's like, it says it here on a piece of paper. Look at the tag. And Fish and Wildlife's like, prove to us these are captive-born monkeys. What the industry and Fish and Wildlife and some other third parties, we've only heard about it as third parties, basically DNA, forensics is what is going to be required. Show the parentage, show that the animal that's sitting in that cage on that tarmac is actually, an F2 captive bred animal. And that is going to be basically impossible for this industry to do.
So with these monkeys, will you talk about where they've been and where they are now?
So we're talking about these specific 1,000.
The 1,000, yeah.
This 1,000 is wow, the arrogance of Charles River Laboratories. Let's start with that, because what we know about, so again, in November of 2022, the indictments came down. Worldwide primates and inactive, we know, are the undisclosed co-conspirators. And at that time, it was kind of in the media that Cambodia was kind of shutting down. We thought, PETA thought, that Cambodia had kind of stopped exports from their company, from their country. Well, it turns out that even though everyone, Fish and Wildlife, everyone in the industry knew that Cambodia was embroiled, Cambodian monkey suppliers, at the highest levels of the government, the people who were signing the CITES permits were caught up in this Fish and Wildlife investigation, and that these monkeys were being laundered, falsely labeled. Charles River thought, it doesn't apply to us, and Charles River kept on bringing shipments of monkeys in during this period. It turns out that Fish and Wildlife said no, and Fish and Wildlife refused to clear the CITES permit. And by not clearing the CITES permit, like basically stamping it, saying, all right, this looks good, boom. Fish and Wildlife said to Charles River, prove to us that these are captive-born monkeys. And Charles River said, I don't know how to do that. I can't do that. And Fish and Wildlife said, well, then you cannot use any of these monkeys that you imported on these shipments. You can't sell them. You can't use them for experiments. And we're talking millions of dollars worth of monkeys. And so there are a couple of options at this stage. Technically, these are still Charles River's monkeys. But we also learned in February that Charles River is now under investigation, under civil and criminal investigations by the Department of Justice. And we haven't seen any of the documents yet. It's just that's been announced, that there are these investigations. Charles River is involved, and it has to do with their monkey imports from Cambodia. So you can imagine that we always knew that the November 2022 indictments were the tip of the iceberg. We now have a pretty good sense that Charles River is the iceberg with this. Charles River is the world's biggest consumer and importer and grinder of monkeys, of animals in general, and certainly of monkeys. So these monkeys, Charles River, like, if we can't use them, then we're gonna try to re-export them. We're just gonna send them back. And this is where it gets very, very complicated. There are basically kind of three options that are available. Fish and Wildlife can seize those monkeys and turn them over to sanctuary. That is the only decent thing that can and should happen. These 1,000, 1,200 monkeys, however many there are, we owe these animals. Charles River, the public, the world owes these animals a happy ending.
Yeah.
And the only happy ending is to send them to sanctuary. And Born Free USA has actually stood up and said, we will do this, but it's going to take a lot of money. The other option is that Charles River is allowed to send them back to Cambodia. And that is a one-way trip. They go back, they die. Charles River will then try to sell them to someone else. They'll be moved across the border and tried to be repackaged and relabeled and kind of resold out of Thailand or out of Vietnam or whatnot. My hope is that the DNA will have been collected on these monkeys. These monkeys will basically be marked at this point. And so in theory, any scientist worth their salt would never, ever use these animals, because they are wild caught. And scientists have said repeatedly, you don't use wild caught monkeys on your experiments. That's bad science. But again, this industry is so horrifically greedy and unscrupulous that these monkeys, if they're sent back, they won't be gambling through the forests of Cambodia. No, they will stay in the cages and they will end up in someone else's facility, whether it's in a Charles River facility in China, or shipped off to someone else. That's a thing.
And the third option is that they kill them.
Third option is if they were seized and there is no place to put them, there's no place for them to be with sanctuary, then the alternative would be to kill them at that stage.
And so right now, because it's been a few months at least that they've been in just limbo, right? But where are they?
They are at the Houston facility, Charles River's Houston's facility, and they're also probably up in the Frederick, Maryland facility. Mm-hmm. So they're divided between those two facilities.
How does this get decided? What needs to happen for them to go to sanctuary?
Pressure.
Yeah, no, we need a ton of pressure.
We need a ton of pressure. It's, we heard about, 3 or 4 weeks ago that Charles River, we had whistleblowers, had notified us that Charles River was trying to send these monkeys back to Cambodia. And so we basically activated the alarm system. And there was tremendous, people were contacting Fish and Wildlife. They were contacting the members of Congress. And we got these monkeys stopped. And so that the last we've heard is that there's no plan right now to send these animals out. And that is absolutely 100%. The support, the pressure that was put by the public when they learned about this, and that, tens of thousands of emails and phone calls went into Fish and Wildlife saying, do not do this. That was incredibly important. Now but we're at this pivot point again. This is 1,000 monkeys. Monkeys live for 20, 25, 30 years.
Right.
This requires the lifetime care of these animals. And there's one entity who should be made to pay for the lifetime care of these entities, and that's Charles River Laboratories, yes. This multi-billion-dollar company who for 50 plus years has been ripping these primates out of the forests, selling them and using them and making money off of them. Charles River needs to pay for the lifetime care of these animals at the Born Free Sanctuary. And that is trying to get Charles River to come to the table and talk about this. Obviously we've tried. We're every pressure point we can, we're touching. I'm sure that the Fish and Wildlife and DOJ and the investigations that are going on are also wanting to do this, because people understand who care about animals, who care about these monkeys, that again, there's only one happy ending. And that happy ending is Charles River paying for the lifetime care of these animals in sanctuary here in the US.
What does this whole case mean for the bigger picture in terms of banning imports and stopping testing on primates, period? This feels like one more of those cases that's pushing us in the right direction in both of those situations.
The only positive thing that can be said about the COVID pandemic was that it made it crystal clear that using monkeys, using any animal as a proxy for humans to develop these vaccines and treatments just didn't work. At the very beginning of the pandemic, Pfizer, Moderna, J&J came right out and said, you know what? Monkeys aren't getting infected with SARS-CoV-2 the same way. They're not responding to the treatments in the same way as humans. We're going to check the regulatory box. This was in 2020. We're going to check the regulatory box, put our vaccines in those monkeys' arms. But actually, they were immediately moving into human relevant testing. They were focusing on humans, human treatments for a pathogen that was impacting humans. The 2022 was an amazing year. So you had that Danville accident that kind of ripped open. The world saw what this industry was about. In July, we had the horrific biosecurity, the zoonotic disease risks that were associated with the monkey importation pipeline became obvious. In November, you had the gross, horrific, blatant illegalities that were taking place in this industry show up. In December, you had more disease stuff coming out. Monkeys coming out of Cambodia, the place where Charles River was pulling them out. The CDC reported that these monkeys were coming in with something called Burkholderia pseudomallei, this select tier 1 agent, this incredibly dangerous pathogen. They were arriving infected with this. Quarantine wasn't catching them. They were leaving quarantine still with these pathogens. Late December, we had the FDA modernization, which basically the FDA, the most conservative agency in the government, came out and said, this reliance upon animal testing to try to move treatments and vaccines through the pipeline, it hasn't worked out so well. 95% of what's working in the animals is not translating into effective treatments in humans. The FDA Modernization Act gave this industry the alternative to use non-animal testing modalities, to focus on organs on a chip, 3D human tissues, stem cells, sophisticated AI, to test these drugs and treatments and to submit those data to the FDA to allow their drugs to move more quickly. So you had everything is now in place. Every block that this animal industry has stood on has been kicked out from under them. It's dangerous. It's dangerous for public health. It's ethically untenable. It's pushed animals to the endangered species, to primates as endangered species. I missed that part of 2022. We called them endangered species. It's not required anymore. And there's so much illegality in this. And actually, you know what? There's not a lot of money to be made at it anymore either, because the industry is shifting. They're realizing that these monkeys are horrifically expensive. This whole process is expensive. The lawyer fees are so high at this stage. Hey, let's use our money. Let's use our innovation. The industry, and this is an innovative industry. And it's time, and this industry is realizing it, not necessarily the animal users, but the rest of the farm industry, and they are pivoting away. So that everything that the monkey industry is, it's crumbling. It's they have no legs to stand on anymore. And that's a good thing, because maybe, just maybe, there is now enough time for these monkeys in the wild to recover from what this US-based industry has done to them.
I mean, it's just so horrific to think that we, for no reason, have made these animals go close to extinct, and in the process tortured them the entire time. Like, they get here, and it's a death sentence. It's torture then death.
We have to stop. There's one thing that we didn't touch on, and if you allow me a moment, so these monkeys in the forests of Asia are what we call keystone species. They are a critical player in the ecosystem. They're prey, they're predator, they're seed disperser. They keep the forest healthy. They actually act as buffers for disease, for like vector-borne, for mosquito and insect-borne transmission to humans. We are actually seeing in places where the forests have been emptied out of macaques, and there are enormous areas in Southeast Asia now where there are no macaques anymore. We're seeing an increase in the prevalence of humans infected with zoonotic malarias that used to just hang out in the monkeys. The mosquitoes are now kind of looking around and saying, there are no macaques to feed on anymore, but there are humans. And these mosquitoes are now feeding on and transmitting this malaria to humans, whereas before the monkeys had been a buffer. The mosquitoes were feeding on the monkeys, and that was there was balance in that ecosystem. This industry has completely upended those ecosystems. So you know who's paying for that? It's the farmer there. It's the villager there. It's the the people who live with these animals that this U.S. industry has ripped away.
Yeah.
So they've just the downstream consequences of this industry that no one is talking about, that this industry certainly doesn't want anyone to talk about, have been hidden up to this point. But the folks there are paying an amazing price for the greed that we see here in the U.S.
I was telling you before we started, I read this piece that was written about you in The Guardian last summer. And it's an incredible piece. We'll put it in the show notes. But it ends with you saying, we have 7 primate centers left in the U.S., and your job for now until the end of time is that you're going to shut them all down. I think you're well on your way.
There are days that I wake up and I would think, wish I just stuck with just shutting down those 7. But we're going after the pipeline. We're going after the source. You shut that source down, and everything downstream dries up. That will be good for everyone. Yeah. Obviously, it'll be good for the monkeys in Asia. It'll be good for the science, though. The era of relying on monkeys to improve human health, it's over. It's done. It's anachronistic. It hasn't worked. It has cost monkey lives. It's cost billions of dollars. It's actually cost human lives because of the delay and the misdirection and the misleading results that we get from these monkey tests. And so, yeah, I'm shutting it all down.
I love it, Lisa. I love it.
We're done. It's just leave the monkeys alone. Let them be monkeys. Let the scientists do good science, do human relevant science, and let these monkeys just do what monkeys do. Let them hang out in the forest. Let them groom. Let them sing. Let them chatter. Let them swim. Let them be happy. And you do that.
Lisa, thank you. Thank you for this. Thank you for your work, all that you're doing for monkeys and for animals and for humans.
I thank you for letting me talk about them today.
To learn more about Lisa, about primate testing, and about these 1,000 monkeys, go to our website, speciesunite.com. We'll have links to everything. We are on Facebook and Instagram at Species Unite. If you have a spare moment and could do us a favor, please subscribe, rate, review on Apple Podcasts or wherever you listen to podcasts. It really helps people find the show. If you'd like to support the podcast, we'd greatly appreciate it. Go to our website, speciesunite.com, and click donate. I would like to thank everyone at Species Unite, including Gary Knudsen, Caitlin Pierce, Amy Jones, Paul Healy, Santina Polke, Ayana Peoples, and Anna Kallner, who wrote and performed today's music. Thank you for listening. Have a wonderful day.